Chapter 33. At home, later Sumiko borrowed Mr. Moto's shovel and started digging on the edge of her garden to extend it. The dirt was so hard. She made slow progress. She kept working even after the sun rose and the May afternoon grew sweltering. Sometimes her feelings were all jumbled together into one huge mess of sadness and fear, and sometimes her thoughts became orderly, and she studied each thought in turn. And sometimes she was only gardening, only thinking of all the flowers she would grow that year. She planned to cultivate up and down the entire length of the barrack. Maybe Mr. Moto would agree to extend the pond, and maybe they could get a tree somehow. Maybe she would live with Mr. Moto, or maybe she could hide in the boiler room while the bus left with Auntie. Her palms grew blistered, and she did not even eat dinner that evening. Just worked and worked, though she could scarcely see in the dark. When she finally stopped, she leaned the shovel against the barrack and sat down among her wheat flowers. If she left the camp, she would not have any friends at all. No more Frank, no more Sachi, no more Mr. Moto. A flock of snowy egrets flew low over the ground beyond. She didn't know what to do. If she left camp, it would be just exactly as if all the years Jishan had worked, and all the years her parents had worked, and all the years her aunt and uncle and cousins had worked, were gone. They'd be starting all over again to make their way in a hostile land, just as Jishan once had. And yet Jishan had found a type of success. She realized suddenly that he had been a happy man, and a brave one. She spotted a weed and jumped up and pulled it out. Then she saw another one and yanked that out. She kept thinking of Jishan on the ship to America, desperately trying to avoid the ultimate boredom. When he got here, all he'd known was hard work. What kind of freedom was that? Then she thought of Frank, and what he had said about his future being here and hers being elsewhere. And she realized that it had not been freedom that Jishan came to America for, but the future. And not his future, but hers. The future of his unborn grandchild. That's why he had left Japan. He had loved her even before she was born. "All right, I'll leave," Sumiko said suddenly, but there was nobody around to hear her decision. That evening, Sumiko sat in the bean fields for several hours waiting for Frank to show up, so she could tell him goodbye. He never did show up, but the next day she went out there again, and the next, and the next, and the next. One day, as Mr. Moto was planting new cuttings, she moseyed up to him. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He stopped working. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other and back again. Her gaze moved to the best carving in the garden, a samurai so realistic. He looked like Isamu Michibuchi, the miniature man of Japanese fairy tales. You wouldn't think a man with one eye could carve like that. "See, I have a friend." Mr. Moto nodded as if he understood. "And I was wanting to give my friend a special present before I leave." Ah, now he definitely understood. "So you're leaving after all." He grunted as he lifted himself from the ground and walked over to the samurai. Then he looked thoughtful. "But do you think the garden will be able to win a prize without this?" Sumiko tried to think of the most truthful answer. "Yes, but it might be harder. That's why the samurai is so special. But the most important part of the garden is the things that live and die." "Oh, a gardening philosopher," Mr. Moto said, laughing. "Here, then, for your friend." He placed the samurai gently in her hands. "For my friend, to do with as she wishes." Sumiko resisted a ridiculous urge she felt to curtsy. "But I haven't got anything for you." You've helped me create the next First Place garden, he said. Frank didn't show up again that day, and finally she left a box in the tunnel. In the box were the papers from Bull, the samurai statue, and a note telling Frank what time she would be leaving in 3 days. Those final days passed quickly. Sumiko talked Auntie into giving her enough money for a candy bar at the canteen, and she gave it to Kenji. So that obligation was taken care of. When the morning of their departure came, the glare from the sun was so intense that Sumiko could hardly keep her eyes open. It was the hottest day so far that year. Mr. Moto helped the family load their things on the bus, but there was no sign of Frank. At least Sachi was there. You're my second best friend, next to Janine, Sachi said. I wish you were staying. My parents think your family is crazy to leave. Maybe, Sumiko said. I can't say yet. Someday when I get out, I'm going to dig up some money I buried before camp. It was possible. Sumiko knew that some people had buried things. All I buried was a knife, she said, thinking about her knife for the first time in months. I buried $7,000. And for the first time, Sumiko noticed some things in Sachi's eyes. Sadness, fear, loneliness. And then Sumiko knew. That was why Sachi lied. Miss Kelly walked up suddenly. Hi, Sumiko said, surprised. Miss Kelly just smiled. Will you be staying, Miss Kelly? Miss Kelly nodded. Until the war ends. She shook hands with Sumiko. People began to board the bus. Tak-Tak walked up with his crickets slung over his shoulder. Sumiko started to step up the stairs, but she stopped. Go on up, Tak-Tak, she said. Save me a seat. She walked back to Mr. Moto. Do you know you have to get new cheesecloth every year? Yes, I've already ordered more. Oh, okay, she said. She turned to go, then paused and turned back to Mr. Moto. Well, do you remember how to collect the seeds? Because my uncle developed that strain of stock, and if you don't save the seeds, the strain will die out and my uncle's work will be wasted. I've brought some of the seeds with me, but you have to keep it going too. She believed these seeds could literally be the future of stock in America. That sounded conceited, but she decided she had to say it out loud. Those seeds may be the future of stock in America. He nodded, smiling a bit. I remember everything you've told me. I had the best teacher in the world. He patted her head fondly. I guess that's it then, she said. He stuck out his hand and shook hers in that aggressive way he had. Suddenly, he seemed to have a tear in his eye, and he hugged her. I always wanted a daughter, he said. She took a last good look at the camp, at the violet-tinged mountains in the distance, and at the darkness moving quickly toward camp. A dust storm. Then she saw something else on the horizon, a small form growing larger, kind of like when she had arrived and she had seen the man on a horse. Even before she could actually make out what it was, she knew. It was a boy on a bicycle. She ran toward the bicycle. The bus driver called out, Hey, where are you going? Just a second, she called back. Several people hollered out to her to hurry. Come on, we'll miss the train in Parker, one woman called. The driver yelled, Get on the bus or we'll leave without you. Sumiko knew that wasn't true and kept running toward Frank. When Frank rode up, he was exhausted. He dropped his bicycle and hurried over. Sorry, I'm late, he said. I brought you something. It belonged to my mother. She said I could give it to you. It was a bracelet, silver and lacy. He put it on her gently, as if her wrist were something precious like a baby bird or a newborn pup. I can still stay, she said, but even as she said it, she knew she couldn't stay, and she knew he didn't want her to. He looked gaunt and sad. I won't have time anymore to see you anyway. His voice broke momentarily. I'm the man of the house for now. He slipped a scrap of paper into one of her hands. "Here's my address. If you write me, I'll try to write back." "I'll write you." He seemed older and much lonelier than he had just a few weeks ago. He did not seem like a young boy anymore. "All right, that's it," called the bus driver. He made as if to close the door. Frank smiled, but weakly. "Bye, Weedflower." She threw her arms around his neck, and they hugged tightly. Auntie and Tac-Tac started calling to her from the windows. She rushed onto the bus but stopped on the steps to shout, "Hurry, or you'll get caught in the dust storm." Frank nodded. She ran to the seat in front of Auntie and watched him from her window. He wasn't hurrying. She opened the window and shouted, "Hurry!" As the bus drove off, she could see him waiting with his bicycle staring at her. The bus picked up speed. She leaned far out her window, calling, "Hurry, hurry!" She screamed, "Hurry!" The dust descended on the bus, and she needed to close her window. After a short time, the tires got stuck and the bus stopped. She looked back toward the camp, half hidden by the swirls of dust. The world outside seemed drained of color, like a brown and white photograph. For a moment, there was a hole in the swirls, and she thought she saw Frank huddled under a blanket. He looked so small. She opened up the paper he'd handed her. It was damp with her perspiration, but she could still read it. He did have an Indian name, that just his family called him. The name was Hulas, which meant lightning. His last name was Butler. She started crying. "He didn't hurry," she said. Auntie reached over the seat to pat her shoulder. "He'll be fine," Auntie said. "He won't. He's a smart boy." "How do you know?" "Because he came to see my little silly." Sumiko was so surprised to hear Auntie call her "my little silly" in an affectionate tone that she stopped crying for a moment. Auntie did not like to show affection. Auntie suddenly blurted, "Thank you for the $6 you set on the table for Uncle and Jishan." Sumiko was flabbergasted. She'd given the money so long ago. Then the moment passed, and Auntie settled back and sat stiffly in her seat. Sumiko leaned her nose against the window. "I'm going to write Frank and Bull once a week," said Sumiko. "I have to write to Frank, Bull, Ichiro, Jishan, and Uncle, and Mr. Moto. 4 relatives, 2 friends." She thought about Sachi and her lying ways. "And Sachi. Even if she lies, she's my friend." The bus lurched forward suddenly. Sumiko kept watching for another opening in the storm, but none came. When the storm finally died down, she was too far from the camp to see anything, except for a lot of bright green growing in the middle of the desert. This is what it felt like to be leaving camp. 1. Like you didn't know if people would let you into their grocery store. 2. Like you were a pioneer in the country you were born in. 3. Like you didn't know if you would ever see your cousins again. 4. Like you had lost a friend. 5. Like maybe you might own a flower shop. Someday.